Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. As promised, Emre Dogru has come back on the podcast for a rapid reaction to Turkey's very surprising first-round election results. Surprising, that is, if you trusted the polls. I warned you many, many times not to trust the polls here, that they weren't telling us anything really about what was actually going to happen, and that at least was true, even though I couldn't give you any insight about which direction it was going. So Emre lays out sort of what happened in the election, why we think what happened, and some thoughts about where it goes going forward. We'll have him back on after the second round for a deeper analysis, but we thank Emre for his time. I know he stayed up late watching the Turkish election results, and so thanks for making the time, Emre. We hope you enjoy this rapid reaction podcast. Cheers, see you out there. Emre, I had a whole funny intro when we first started recording, and then 2 minutes into the recording, the internet crapped out. So I'm not going to repeat the funny intro story, but the point of the funny intro story was to say, you know, this election result here, the first round election result, it feels like as unexpected as Brexit was, and it feels as unexpected as Trump's victory was in 2016, just because all of the polls were saying that the opposition looked good. And there was even, after that opposition candidate, whose name I can't pronounce and that I'll trust you to educate me on, when he dropped out this week, maybe that was what was going to push Kılıçdaroğlu over the 50% margin. So I guess I want to, before we hit the election results itself, I think I just want to ask you, how do you account for why the polls were so wrong here? I mean, the result that we've gotten, it doesn't look like Erdogan's going to win outright with 50%, so we're probably going to get a second round runoff. But the election results we're getting with Erdogan at roughly 49%, Kılıçdaroğlu around 44-45%, that's not what polls were saying. So how do we account for the unexpected nature of these results?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, Jacob. So as you said, based on the previous performance, we have been looking into the most reliable polls, and they have been saying that, as you said, the results would be other way around. So actually, the opposition camp was expecting and hoping for a first-round victory, whereas President Erdogan, as you said, secured 49.5% of the votes in the first round. So clearly, the polls missed something, and that something looks like the national sentiment of the Turkish people. Because if you look at the results more in detail, it's quite obvious that one of the main drivers that resulted in this outcome is the national sentiment that the Turkish people wanted known. So it seems like the opinion polls did miss that deep wave, as it's called in Turkey, that sentiment, the feeling, and how that would change the voter behavior here.
How would you respond to, because I know the CHP has already been saying that there was obstructions to voting and sort of blaming it on that. How legitimate do you think the election result is? I mean, I'm not one to cast doubts on it, but this seems to me like I mean, on the one hand, you could say 49.5%, oh, that looks suspicious. That's just enough to push it to a second round runoff, but enough also to show that Erdogan is in the league. At the same time, though, I mean, all this pushing about the polls and all the talk has been, one direction, and it seems kind of like sour grapes and sore losers to me, to be like, oh, but really they obstructed everything at the ballot box. Do you feel like this was, I don't know, like as somebody living in Turkey, do you feel like there was any foul play here, or do you feel like this was a fair contest and the opposition just didn't sell their message well to the Turkish people?
So, in terms of my data analysis and my observations, and also the observations of people around me, we haven't seen any obstruction in the voting and counting process. So it was a fairly peaceful and quiet voting process. I mean, there were, of course, a couple of incidents here and there, but for a close election like this one, it was a fairly quiet election. So that doesn't mean that the entire election period was fair. Of course, the government and President Erdogan used, most of the capacities of the states, of the government, making investments and, of course, launching big projects as an election campaign. And the opposition, of course, did not have that kind of possibility. But still, the electoral processes in Turkey is quite fair, and it's usually reliable. One thing, in addition to that, is that almost 90% of the people went to the ballot box. So it's one of the record turnouts in Turkish history, and I believe, one of the record turnouts around the globe. So a lot of people, both from government side and opposition side, They counted the votes. They waited until 6 a.m., 7 a.m. in the morning to make sure that all the votes are properly counted and submitted to the Supreme Election Board. So there is a lot of observation and a lot of monitoring in this process. And I don't agree with the allegations that the electoral process were obstructed.
And I'm going to ask you an impossible question here, and let's see if you can dance around an answer, which is, Erdogan, even though he has had a very impressive showing, he did have lower vote share in almost every single province in the country compared to where he had before. So there was some evidence that voters had soured on Erdogan a little bit, and we'll see if that shakes out in the second round. But I was actually more struck by the fact that the CHP, they seem to get they got around 25% of the vote. They seem to always get around 25% of the vote if you go back to recent Turkish presidential elections. And I was just wondering, do you think there was actually an opportunity for the opposition here, and it was just that Kılıçdaroğlu was underwhelming, or maybe some of the things that he said in the weeks leading up to the campaign really landed wrong, and as you said, went against that nationalist faction? Or do you feel like really the Turkish electorate had kind of already made up its mind, and there was nothing, it doesn't matter if it's Kılıçdaroğlu or anyone else, what the CHP said, like by and large, it was going to be Erdogan or some flavor of nationalist party that was going to be allied with him anyway, that was going to go forward. Do you think CHP had a chance here, or do you think it was really, actually they had a chance and it was the wrong candidate or the wrong message or something like that?
In terms of the decrease in the Justice and Development Party, also known as the AKP's votes, we never expected those votes to be translated into the victory of CHP, because these are two different camps of political spectrum, right? So, and one of the things that this election made very obvious is that it's identity politics, nationalist feelings, attachment to a certain identity and political party that determines voter behavior. So despite all the hardships that the Turkish people experienced over the past few years, such as COVID-19, the earthquake, currency fluctuation, the record inflation, the economic fluctuations, everything, seems like most of the voters of the ruling camp stayed within the ruling camp. So that means there are some different transitions from the Justice and Development Party to minor parties, such as Renewed Welfare Party, which is a minor party, but it's like a more religious fundamentalist party. So they gained 2.8% of the votes, and they will be in the parliament with 5 seats. Most of the people didn't expect that. So it seems like there is a transition and a switch of votes within the opposition, within the government camp, and also within the opposition camp, but not between the two. So I don't think that it's because of the leader, but it's because of the ideologies and, as I said, identity politics.
Yeah, that's such an important point. When I look at other things around the world, like for a really good place where this happens is when you get into a debate about Scottish independence, and people always trot out, well, economically it would be terrible for Scotland to try and vote for independence. Yeah, it was economically asinine for the UK to leave the European Union as well. There is something about when a politician or a political party can tap into that kind of feeling or sentiment that you're talking about, it overrides sort of base economic interests, I feel like. And to your point, in some ways, that is the real story of Erdogan. I mean, he came to power amidst an economic crisis with high inflation and everything else. But somehow he has created that emotional pull between himself and what he represents, and enough of the Turkish electorate that, he can have, I don't know what else he could have done badly to lose his position. I mean, inflation over 80%, the controversy around the earthquake. I mean, so many things have gone badly against him, but he still seems to have that emotional pull with a large, we can't call it a majority yet, but with a large bunch of the electorate.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the earthquake, by the way, the results are also very interesting. It seems like most of the provinces in the earthquake support President Erdogan for the presidential election, and also his Justice and Development Party as well. So, except for 2 provinces, which are Adana and Hatay, the other 8 provinces really supported President Erdogan. So it seems like his message that the earthquake was an act of God, and the government and President Erdogan himself is not responsible for it. And of course, President Erdogan will give the affected people new homes within 1 year, resonated very well by the people who were very affected, who lost their loved ones in that region. So that's, of course, an emotional subject. And of course, it's, for the people who live there, they also have this identical and ideological attachments to the President Erdogan and his political party as well. And this promise that he's going to give back what they lost was a major promise by the ruling camp. The fact that the opposition was not able to convince the voters there is something that I think they need to be thinking about.
Yeah. As we look forward here, so the runoff will be in about a month's time. Do you think the opposition has a chance? Or is this really just going to be a coronation for another however many years of Erdogan's rule?
It's going to be in 2 weeks, actually, on 28. So it's going to be in 2 weeks. So if you look at the polls right now, so it's 49% fight for President Erdogan. And by the way, I think Erdogan gained a lot of legitimacy, in terms of international recognition and reputation as well, by accepting 49.5% of the votes as running for the second round. So it's an important point for the Turkish democracy as well. Kılıçdaroğlu, the main opposition candidate, got like 44.8%. And then the Sinan Oğan, the third candidate, the Nationals candidate, got 5.1%. So there will be elections in 2 weeks between just Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu, and whoever gets the majority of the votes will be the president. So based on, of course, the current results, we can think that most of the voters of the third candidates, who now appears to be and emerges as a kingmaker for the second round, it seems like his voters are mostly nationalists and some secularist voters who could not vote for Erdogan due to their secularist feelings, but who could not also vote for Kılıçdaroğlu, who allied with the Kurdish political party. So they were stuck in between, and they voted for the third candidate, Sinan Oğan, who actually was blamed for dividing the votes of the opposition. But it turned out that he is the only reason that Turkey is going to the second round of elections right now. That being said, there is one more thing, Jacob, that we need to keep in mind is the parliament. There is still a parliament in Turkey. And the parliamentary distribution is also very, very interesting because, again, based on the all failed opinion polls before the elections, we were expecting the ruling camp to get maximum 290 seats in the parliament out of 600. So nobody expected the ruling camp or the opposition camp to get majority of the votes. So the third alliance, which was mostly led by the Kurdish political party, was going to be the key in the parliamentary and legislative process. Now, that turned out to be wrong. So the ruling alliance, President Erdogan's political party, his nationalist movement party ally, and other minor political parties, they received, they got 320 seats in the parliament, which gives them a comfortable majority to pass any legislation except for the constitution. So now that the ruling camp has an absolute majority in the parliament, could also change Turkish people's voting behavior, because we haven't experienced this before. Okay, so we don't know how the Turkish people will react when there is a clear majority in the parliament. So we don't know if the Turkish people will give their votes to opposition to balance the parliament's power, or they're going to support the ruling camp again, not to create a imbalanced situation or more uncertainty. My bet is that they're going to vote for the ruling camp and President Erdogan. So probably we're going to see a clear victory in the second round. But of course, 2 weeks is a long time in Turkey and in politics in general. So there is a lot of negotiation to be conducted among these parties. So let's see what happens.
No, that's a really important point as well. And we can get lost in the presidential election and miss that, well, there was a parliamentary election that was decisive for the AKP. Yeah. Does that sort of mean... So, I mean, let's do a hypothetical here. Even if the opposition had won the presidency, but then AKP had this majority in parliament, doesn't that effectively mean that the opposition wasn't going to be able to do anything anyway? That basically the structure that Erdogan has set up is going to continue with the executive presidency, and the AKP sort of continuing on with its project for Turkey? I mean, in that sense, that was where the real election was, right? I mean, the president at this point is just the figurehead if you have that majority in parliament.
So the president has a lot of executive powers, and one of the things that he or she can do is, of course, to appoint high-level officials. And I think for investors and business people, this is quite important because the president can appoint the governor of central bank, the head of competition authority, head of stock market, whatever. So he has vast powers in terms of appointments and changing the entire bureaucratic system. Secondly, the president also has the power to prepare a budget and submit to the parliament. Also has the power to issue presidential decrees and sort of using legislative powers to legislate certain things on administrative matters. So if the parliament is owned by the ruling camp, the current ruling camp, President Erdogan's political party and his allies, but the president is elected from the opposition camp, of course, the system will be in deadlock. And probably we're going to see another early election in a couple of years. And by the way, talking about the election, I think the next target of President Erdogan is the local elections that will take place next year in 2024. Because as you might remember, in 2019, the opposition camp won especially big cities, but also predominantly in Istanbul and Ankara. So it seems like the ruling camp will be working on regaining the power, the municipality, local governments in Istanbul and Ankara, and will probably aim for Izmir as well, which is a stronghold of the opposition party. So, things are still moving in Turkish political field.
I'm glad you mentioned the investors and the other foreign observers who have been watching this closely. You saw a bump in Turkish equity, really all Turkish assets sort of in the last week or so, as people were expecting maybe the opposition was going to carry it out. Just looking right now, we're recording here. It's Monday morning Central Time in the United States. It's afternoon, evening there in Istanbul. It looks like Turkish stocks down 6 to 7% on the day. The lira is weakening on the dollar. It's not quite at 20, but it's flirting with 20. It's definitely not. It's not been a good day for the lira.
Exactly.
But I guess my question there is, it feels like one of the reasons that Erdogan's economic and monetary policies have been so unorthodox was because he was headed towards this election. He knew that he really needed to win this election and control the system so that he could, have this. This is his first time really being elected with a full term with this executive presidency as well. Do you think that this opens the door to some normalization of Turkish monetary policy, that Erdogan can declare mission accomplished and not be worried about an election on his shoulders, and he can pivot and be a little more welcoming to foreign investors? Or do you think that that's a naive hope, and that it was really with the opposition being so soundly defeated, not just for the presidency, but especially in parliament, that foreign investors are still going to look at Turkey with a very skeptical eye based on how Erdogan has done things over the past couple of years?
Erdogan and his government is welcoming of investors, except for the fact that they need to accept Turkey's own terms and Erdogan's own terms, which means that I see it's quite unlikely that President Erdogan and the central bank will raise the interest rates anytime soon. So there is no going back to orthodox policies because the Turkish economy needs to grow for the fact that there is a huge population, and the Erdogan and his government needs to keep unemployment low. So keeping the interest rates low is a key factor in that. And he made a very political positioning out of that economic choice. So it seems like there is no going back from that. But there might be some signs of normalization, like some banking rules or some other rules on the capital. So I don't think that policy interest rates will increase, but as I said, there might be some other measures that will be put in place.
Yeah. Last sort of question here. Erdogan had his health scare on the campaign trail. He is not a young man, and he's had the stresses of office, and it's been a very difficult time to be a political leader in the world, and not least for a country like Turkey that is at the center of so many economic and political and military and security issues. My question is just, eventually Erdogan will not be around. Is there an heir apparent? Is the AKP grooming someone? Do you think that Erdogan has a trusted lieutenant that he's going to start trying to groom as somebody who will take over eventually? Or do you think he's not even really thinking that way, or that that's not really how Turkish politics works? Because, I expect, his healthcare aside, I expect him to be around for many, many more years, but he is getting a little bit older. I wonder if there is anyone kind of waiting in the wings, or I don't know, is 70 the new 50? Because, in the United States, we're about to have two octogenarians go at it against each other. So maybe it's a crazy question. I just wondered if there is some kind of heir apparent or some kind of person who will eventually take the mantle.
I mean, there are some names floating around. Some of them, are being taken seriously more and more. The one that is more being discussed is his son-in-law, Selçuk Bayraktar, who is also very much involved in defense industry and Turkish drones, the Bayraktar drones. So his name is also around, and the head of national defense, the Minister of National Defense, who is actually now a member of the parliament, is also one of the persons that people are looking at. But just coming back to your question, there is no heir apparent for the moment. So it seems like the President Erdogan and his inner circle will continue to be governing Turkey for the next at least a few years, maybe 5 years. So that's the situation that we're in right now.
And I guess you mentioned this earlier, and I guess I should have asked it when you mentioned it as well. What does this mean for the Kurds in general in Turkey? I mean, is this... Because it seemed it didn't register to me that the Turkish opposition was courting the support of the Kurds, because I thought they would have known they would have gotten the Kurds anyway. They were never going to vote for Erdogan in general. But where do you see the participation of Kurds in Turkish democracy going forward based on these results? Is it just they're just going to be consigned to voting but not being able to express anything? I mean, it seems like a difficult position for them.
The Kurdish political party, which entered the elections under another political party name, because there were some legal questions about there was a constitutional court process going on. So they got 8.8% of the votes and 62 seats in the parliament this time. So it's quite a bit of gain for them. And they supported Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. The Kurdish political party did not come up with its own candidate. So rather than that, they support Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu as the candidate. And when we look at the electoral map of Turkey, it seems like the Kurdish political party's support to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was full, right? So all the voters of the Kurdish political party, HDP, supported Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, especially in the areas where the Kurdish voters are concentrated. That being said, so they're going to be in the parliament, but its previous chairman, Selahattin Demirtas, is still in jail, and it seems like he's going to be, in jail for because the government hasn't changed. That was one of the promises of the main opposition party and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. But since the government is not changing, and we're going to see what happens in the second round, but under current circumstances, seems like the Kurdish political movement is under a lot of stress.
Well, to your point, it really underscores just how small a portion of the electorate the CHP has been able to attract. Because if they're getting that full bore support from Kurdish parties and Kurdish parts of Turkey, and everybody else is going for Erdogan, even though Erdogan's had a difficult time, it just kind of underscores that.
It was a hard trade-off for the main opposition, because on the one hand, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was able to get the support of the Kurdish voters, but of course, that came with a price, which is the fact that some secularist and nationalist voters who would normally vote for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu said that, if you're aligning with the Kurdish political party, which is usually associated and affiliated with the outlawed terrorist organization called PKK. So the secularists, the nationalist secularist voters of the opposition said that if they are with you, we are not going to vote for you. So that was a hard trade-off.
Yeah. Emre, you've been very generous with your time. I know you were up all night. You probably want to go. Before I let you go, my father-in-law came over for breakfast this weekend, and he was trying to have me teach him how to say Kılıçdaroğlu's name. And so I said, well, my guy Emre tried to teach me how to do it. But I thought just before we could go, could you teach the listeners here of this podcast what happens with the letter G in Turkish? So Erdogan, it's in your last name. Like, how should they pronounce that and not
so
look
if there is a sign or a G, that's kind of a so we don't really pronounce that. So Kılıçdaroğlu is like, Kılıç is sword. So Kılıçdar is like someone like swordman, and the Kılıçdaroğlu is like the son of the swordman. So it's that maybe can help our listeners to keep in mind Kılıçdaroğlu.
What does Erdogan mean?
It's not a noun that we use on a daily basis. Ad is like someone who's brave, and Erdogan is like someone who's born as brave. That's how can I translate? Yeah.
Well, not a lot of optimism here for the opposition, but hey, at least Kılıçdaroğlu can say his name means son of a swordsman. He wins the duel of names. So, Emre, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Jacob.
We'll take some time. We might do some more analysis this week, but certainly after the second round, we'll have you back and we'll dive a little bit deeper. So we appreciate you.
With pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.